morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Dr. Aditi Mukherji, and I was one of the coordinating lead authors for the water chapter. For today's webinar, I'm going to present some of our main findings on carbon dioxide removals and trade-offs with water and food security. To be very honest, this was a relatively small section in the water chapter where we had looked at not only carbon dioxide removals but also other mitigation measures, and we had tried to see in that particular section what were the trade-offs as well as synergies with adaptation and mitigation, and how various mitigation measures including CDRs actually helped with or was negatively impacted water and food. But today for this presentation, I'm going to talk about the three main CTRs that we had briefly assessed in the chapter. So overall, our chapter had concluded that many mitigation measures, and this I have included in the brackets, was not there in the chapter specifically, including CDR approaches and technologies, have considerable water footprint, high confidence, which must be managed in socially and politically accepted ways to reduce the water intensity of mitigation while increasing synergies with sustainable development. Medium evidence, high agreement. So this was our one of our key conclusions from the water chapter when it came to synergies between mitigation and adaptation. We looked at three CDR approaches and technologies. The first is the bioenergy crop, and our finding was that bioenergy crops by themselves can limit global warming by the end of 21st century to 1.5 according to one study, but it can potentially also double the global area and population living under severe water stress compared to the current baseline. Basically saying that yes, you can grow bioenergy crops, but then if you do so, it would be seriously compromising on water security, and there is also a constraint to how much land is actually available. Through these bioenergy crops can significantly impact food prices via demand for land and water. So there are a few studies that looks at the impact of bioenergy crops on food as well as water prices, and the impacts were largely negative. We also briefly looked at afforestation and reforestation, as did many other chapters in the working group too, given that afforestation, and also some of the related approaches also have a very clear adaptation co-benefit. What we said was it is obviously a hugely popular tool for mitigation and CDR, with some very optimistic estimates saying additional 5 billion hectare of canopy covered in suitable locations could store 205 gigatons of carbon. Basically, this whole thing about afforestation and reforestation as the silver bullet. Obviously, this is hugely contested. What our chapter found and assessed from the existing literature was that if done at inappropriate locations or with inappropriate species, actually the trade-offs between land biodiversity and water resources can be pretty high and pretty negative, and it can have a lot of negative impacts on local population, particularly indigenous populations who often depend on these forest resources. Another one of these global assessments, such as the global assessment on forest and water, which we also cited in the water chapter, said that afforestation and reforestation should be concentrated in water abundant location where transpiration can potentially be captured downwind as precipitation. There is a distinct field that water hydrologists have been working and foresters have been working for a long time. It's called forest hydrology, and there's a lot of literature around appropriate siting of forest and which forests are good for hydrology, or which forests actually have negative impacts on hydrological cycles. So I think this is when forests are discussed in the context of mitigation of CDR, it's very important to bring on board that huge, like centuries old knowledge actually that we have around forest hydrology as well. Overall extensive BECCS, that's bioenergy, also bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, and afforestation, reforestation deployment can actually alter water cycle at regional scales. And there is evidence that it can happen once these are extensively deployed for afforestation, reforestation. We already have evidence of alteration of water cycle at regional levels. The third technology that we looked at very briefly again was direct water capture. And again, here some of the projections, and I know that Working Group 3 has dedicated a lot more time and attention to all of these CTRs. But overall projection shows that DAC could reduce emissions by up to 3 gigaton per year by 2035, equivalent to 7% of 2019 global emissions. But can increase net consumption of water by 35 kilometer cube in a year in a low overshoot scenario. And capturing 10 gigaton of CO2 could translate to water losses between 10 to 100 cubic kilometers, depending on the technology deployed versus climatic conditions. Similarly, like DAC technologies remain untested, can also significantly impact food prices and demand for water. And this all in the context of a time when we know that, and this is where water chapter of Working Group 2 clearly shows that climate change has already impacted all components of the water cycle. And we also know, based on our observed data of over more than a century, that some parts of the world are getting wetter, some are getting drier, and some of the results in our chapter shows that, and studies have already showing that approximately 4 billion people are already experiencing water scarcity for at least a month in the year. And not all of these is obviously related to climate change. Some of it is, but it's also related to a host of non-climatic factors, water demand, demographic pressures, governance, and a whole host of it. And water scarcity is not only about water quantity, but it's also about water quality. It's also about hazards. It's also about floods and droughts. So water scarcity is kind of water scarcity is just one manifestation of water insecurity, because water insecurity covers a lot more of these. So therefore, chances are that more than half of the world's population are not only water scarce, but they also suffer from water insecurity. And that's already happening now. What's also important is that as we said, that since 1950s, almost half a billion, 500 million people have seen changes in parts of their world getting wetter. 163 million have seen their parts getting drier. So overall, a large proportion of humanity are experiencing climate change through changes in the water cycle. And this is only projected to intensify. And here the main point of this graph, of this figures, which is also from the chapter 4, is that not only are precipitation changes happening, but the associated uncertainties are also quite uncertain, and they're also projected to increase with global warming. So most of our work kind of depends on the central estimates, and we are showing the central estimates are which averages out between the various scenarios, etc., actually may not always be the most correct indicator of, or the current this indicator of the changes that are in the offing, because there are higher uncertainties, the changes could go either way, and those uncertainties actually make it even harder to plan for water resource management in the future. And add to that the additional pressures from CDR, water pressures, means that we have to be really, really careful on what is planned where. So this map actually shows that the kinds of policy challenges that we have globally, and what these different dots really mean is that areas with these gray dots mean that there is a low water scarcity, but also the uncertainty in the future is also stable or predictable, while in a very high ones are where water scarcity is already high, but the uncertainty in future projections is also quite high. So those are the areas with high challenge. To sum up, again, bringing it back to the issue of CDR, governance of CDR must ensure, and now we know that CDR is one of those things that is necessary to keep ourselves within net zero targets. So governance of CDR must ensure water and food security are not compromised. So some of the questions going forward is who decides which approaches and technologies are deployed, who designs and implement them, and where are water footprints and food impacts understood and modeled. For say for forestry, for forestation, there is just wide range of literature already available, or where those forests are suitable and where they are not. Are we using those in answering some of these location questions? Also importantly, and working group 2 is quite vocal about equity in climate impacts, lack of equity in climate impacts, and how will those who are negatively affected have their voices heard. So it is also clear, therefore, that there is a need for multi-level polycentric governance with multiple layers of players, each accountable to one another, and particularly with participation of local communities in CDR decisions and deployment. To conclude, water and food security issues, water and food people must have a seat at the CDR table, along with the indigenous communities and others who are directly affected. Thank you, and I will stop sharing.